Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to be taking a look at some new research about Mars that's come out in Nature Geoscience. And it's really kind of shaking up what we thought we knew about the planet's history. So for a long time,
Mm.
we've pictured ancient Mars as like this watery world with rivers carving out valleys, pretty much the way they do here on Earth. But
Right.
what if there was another force at play? One that we're not as familiar with.
It really challenges our assumptions. This study suggests that liquid carbon dioxide, the CO2 we exhale, could have been a major player in shaping the Martian landscape.
So CO2 flowing like rivers on
It
Mars.
sounds pretty wild, right?
Yeah, it sounds kind of like science fiction.
I know it does, doesn't it? But we're
Yeah.
talking about Mars billions of years ago, and it potentially had a much denser atmosphere than what we see today. Under those conditions, CO2 could have existed as a liquid, even at temperatures that would seem pretty cold to us.
Okay, so a thicker atmosphere means more pressure, which could allow CO2 to become liquid. I get that. But how would liquid CO2 actually carve out the channels and valleys we see?
Well, the study focuses on a process called carbonation. And it's actually pretty straightforward. CO2 reacts with certain types of rocks, and it gets absorbed into their structure, forming something called carbonates.
So the CO2 basically becomes part of the rock.
Exactly. And here's where it gets really interesting. This process of carbonation actually weakens the rock, making it more susceptible to erosion.
Hmm.
So imagine like a steady flow of liquid CO2, slowly dissolving and breaking down the rock over a really, really long time, eventually carving out those distinct Martian features.
So it's not like sudden catastrophic floods. It's more of a slow and steady, almost like chemical kind of erosion.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what's even more compelling is that the types of minerals that we actually see on Mars today totally line up with this carbonation process.
Yeah. Wow. It really makes you rethink what we thought we knew about Mars. I mean, we've been so focused on finding evidence of past water activity. What if some of those features we thought were from water were actually carved by CO2?
That's the question that scientists are going to be grappling with for a while. And it definitely raises the stakes for future missions. Can you imagine the Curiosity rover suddenly sending back data suggesting ancient CO2 flows?
I mean, it would fundamentally change how we interpret Martian geology.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
We might have to rethink where we send the rovers in the future, the types of instruments we put on them, even how we interpret the data.
And it goes even beyond just geology. Think about the search for past life on Mars. If we're looking for signs of life, we need to understand all the processes that shaped the planet, not just the ones that are familiar to us from Earth.
It's like we've been reading this book about Mars, but we've only been paying attention to the chapters about water. And now we're realizing there's this whole other section on CO2,
Yeah.
and it might hold crucial pieces of the puzzle.
The lead author of the study, Michael Hack, he said, "We need to consider a wider range of scenarios. It's possible that liquid CO2 played a more significant role than we previously thought."
He's basically saying we need to think outside our Earth-centric bubble, right? Just because water has been so important here on Earth doesn't mean it's the only way a planet can evolve.
Exactly. And that's a really important point. This isn't just about rocks and rivers on Mars. It's about challenging our assumptions and expanding our understanding of what's possible out there in the universe.
Now, before we go too far down that cosmic rabbit hole, let's bring it back to Mars for a second. So if liquid CO2 was so prevalent in the planet's past, where did it all go? Why isn't Mars this, like, bubbling cauldron of liquid CO2 today?
That's a great question.
Mhm.
And the answer is that Mars has changed a lot over billions of years. As the planet lost its magnetic field, it also lost much of its atmosphere.
So the thinner atmosphere meant less pressure, and CO2 couldn't exist as a liquid on the surface anymore.
Exactly. The CO2 that didn't escape into space likely froze into ice at the poles. Or it got trapped as carbonates in the rocks.
It's kind of crazy to think that those Martian rocks might be holding clues to a past where CO2 flowed freely across the surface.
And that's not all. There's another possibility that's really intriguing. While liquid CO2 might not be stable on the surface of Mars today, it could still exist underground, where the pressure and temperature conditions are different.
So we might not see CO2 rivers on Mars today, but there could be hidden reservoirs beneath the surface still shaping the planet in subtle ways.
That's a possibility that scientists are actively exploring. And this is where the real detective work begins. How do we find evidence of this ancient or even ongoing CO2 activity? What kind of clues should we be looking for?
Those are all great questions, and those are questions that we'll be exploring in the next part of our deep dive. But first, there was something that caught my eye. In the comments on the blog post about this study, one commenter, Aidan Dunn, he brought up a really interesting point about temperature. He was suggesting that CO2 might be liquid at a much wider range of temperatures than water, which could have some pretty interesting implications for Mars.
Yeah, he makes a good point. If CO2 can be liquid at lower temperatures than water, it might have been shaping the Martian landscape even during periods when the planet wasn't warm enough for liquid water.
It changes how we think about Martian geology, right?
It's totally.
We might have been too quick to assume that liquid water was the only thing going on, but CO2, with its wider temperature range for being a liquid, could have been active during periods when water was frozen solid.
And that brings us to this really fundamental question. If we've been so focused on water, have we been missing a crucial part of the Martian story? And what does that tell us about our own biases when we study other planets?
It's a thought-provoking question for sure, and it's one that we'll continue to explore in the next part of our deep dive. But for now, I want you to consider this. What if some of those features that we thought were from water on Mars were actually shaped by CO2? And what other surprises might be waiting for us as we continue to explore Mars?
Welcome back to the deep dive. We're continuing our exploration of liquid CO2 on Mars, and honestly, my mind is still spinning from that thought we left off with last time. What if we've misinterpreted some of the things we've seen on Mars, just because we've been so focused on water? It's a pretty humbling thought, right? It's like we bring our earthly biases with us everywhere we go, even when we're exploring other planets.
And this idea that CO2 could have been a liquid at a wider range of temperatures than water really changes things. It could mean that CO2 was shaping Mars even when the planet was too cold for liquid water.
Right, and that raises another really interesting question. Could there have been times when CO2 was like the main force shaping Mars, and water was just kind of frozen and inactive on the sidelines?
It's like flipping our whole understanding of Mars on its head. Instead of water carving those valleys, maybe it was CO2 the whole time.
Yeah, and it makes you think about Mars in a different way.
Yeah.
Instead of this ancient frozen desert, maybe it was more dynamic, with periods of CO2 activity happening and then periods of water activity. It paints a much more complex and interesting picture, don't you think?
Absolutely. And it makes me wonder if CO2 really was shaping the surface. What kind of unique features might it have created? Are there things on Mars that we've been misinterpreting this whole time?
That's what scientists are going to be looking for now. They'll be looking at those high-resolution images from orbit, trying to find landforms that might have been formed by CO2. And of course, the rovers on the ground will be really important in this investigation.
Yeah, can you imagine Curiosity rolling up to a rock formation and finding those carbonate signatures we talked about? It would be like finding a fossil, but a fossil of a geological process, not a living thing.
I love that analogy. And it's not just about looking for the carbonates. Scientists will also be looking at the shapes and patterns of Martian landforms to see if they look more like they were formed by CO2 erosion than by water erosion.
So it's like a multi-pronged approach, combining data from orbit with analysis from the rovers on the ground and even experiments back here on Earth.
You got it. It takes all of those different perspectives to really understand this. It's like solving a really complex puzzle, with each piece adding to the overall picture.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about CO2 shaping the surface of Mars. But there's a bigger question here. What does this all mean for the search for life beyond Earth? I mean, we know that water is essential for life as we know it, but could life exist in a place with a lot of CO2?
It's a question that's going to keep scientists busy for years to come. We think of life needing water, but life is also amazingly resilient and adaptable.
Yeah, like here on Earth, we have extremophiles. Those are organisms that can live in environments that would be deadly to most other life forms. Could there be Martian extremophiles, maybe microbial life, that could use CO2 or even thrive in a CO2-rich environment?
It's definitely a possibility. Imagine a form of life that doesn't need water, but instead uses CO2 for its biological processes. It would be so different from anything we know. It would be truly alien.
It's mind-blowing, right? It makes you wonder if our definition of life is too narrow. Maybe we're limited by our experiences here on Earth.
That's exactly right. And this discovery about liquid CO2 on Mars might make us rethink how we search for life beyond Earth. Maybe we need to start looking in places we thought were inhospitable because we were looking for the wrong signs of life.
So it's like we've been searching for a needle in a haystack, but looking for the wrong kind of needle, and now we're realizing that there might be a whole different kind of needle out there, and it might even be more interesting than the one we were looking for before.
This is a good reminder that we need to stay open-minded and expect the unexpected. The universe is full of surprises, and the more we explore, the more we realize that there's so much we still don't know.
This is what I find so exciting about science. It's not just about getting the answers, it's about asking better questions, challenging what we think we know, and being ready for something new.
Speaking of new possibilities, there's another really interesting aspect to this CO2 research that we haven't talked about yet. What it could mean for sending humans to Mars.
You're talking about actually using the CO2, right?
Exactly. If we could find those underground reservoirs of liquid CO2,
Yeah.
it could be a game changer for human exploration.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine being able to extract that CO2 and use it to make fuel and building materials, maybe even use it to make breathable air or terraform the planet.
Whoa, terraforming Mars with CO2. Now that sounds like science fiction.
I know, right? But it's an idea that scientists are actually thinking about. CO2 is a greenhouse gas, and if we released enough of it into the Martian atmosphere, it could potentially warm the planet and make it more habitable for humans.
I can picture it now. Future Martian colonists using CO2 from underground to build their homes, grow food, and even transform the whole planet.
It's an incredible vision, and it shows just how important this discovery could be. We started by thinking about CO2 as just a simple gas, and now we're realizing that it might be the key to unlocking the future of Mars.
It just goes to show that every scientific discovery, even the ones that seem small at first, can lead to all sorts of new possibilities.
And that's what makes science so exciting. It's a journey of discovery, and you never really know where it might take you.
Well, I think we can all agree that this deep dive into liquid CO2 on Mars has been a pretty amazing journey. We've questioned what we thought we knew, considered new ideas, and even imagined a future where humans could use CO2 to create a new home on Mars.
It's been a really fascinating exploration, and it's a great example of why we do what we do. We explore the mysteries of the universe, not just to get answers, but to stay curious, imagine new things, and remind ourselves that there's always more to learn, discover, and wonder about.
And on that note, we're going to leave you with one final thought. If something like liquid CO2 can shape a whole planet, what else is possible out there? Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and never lose that sense of wonder.
Until next time, keep looking up.
Welcome back to the deep dive for the final part of our look at liquid CO2 on Mars. We've talked about a lot of really interesting stuff so far, from ancient CO2 rivers to the idea that there could be some kind of CO2-based life. But now I want to get practical. How do we go from these theories and ideas to actually finding real evidence?
It's kind of like we found this amazing mystery, and now we're going to start looking for clues.
Yeah.
And the good news is we have some pretty amazing tools to help us do that, both on Mars itself and back here on Earth.
So what are scientists actually doing to try to figure out if the CO2 idea is real?
Well, first of all, we've got the rovers on Mars, Curiosity and Perseverance.
Yeah.
They're basically mobile labs with all these instruments that can analyze the rocks.
Right, so they could look for those carbonate signatures, like we talked about, the ones that would show CO2 had been absorbed into the rock.
You got it. And they can do even more than that. They can look at the structure of the rocks and see if there are patterns of erosion that might be specific to CO2. You see, water and CO2, even though they're both liquids, they interact with rock in slightly different ways. And those differences might still be visible in the rock, even after all this time.
It's like they're looking for the fingerprints of the CO2 long after it's gone.
I like that. And then we also have the missions that are orbiting Mars, like the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter.
What can they see from orbit that the rovers can't?
Well, they can use radar to look below the surface of Mars and map out what's down there. Imagine finding a huge underground reservoir of liquid CO2. That would be an incredible discovery.
Yeah, that would be amazing. But let's be real here. Even with all the technology we have, finding proof of ancient CO2 activity on Mars is going to be incredibly difficult.
Oh, absolutely. It's not going to be easy. But that's where the brilliant minds of scientists come in. They're always coming up with new ways to do things, new instruments and techniques. They're constantly pushing the limits of what's possible.
And it's not just about what we do on Mars, right? There's got to be things we can do here on Earth to help us understand this better.
Absolutely. We can actually recreate Martian conditions in our labs here. We can simulate the high pressures and temperatures that probably existed on early Mars, and then experiment with CO2, see how it interacts with different rocks, and compare that to what we see on Mars.
So it's like a two-pronged approach. We're looking for evidence on Mars itself, and we're doing experiments here to see if it all fits together.
Right. And there's another really powerful tool we have, computer modeling. We can use computers to create simulations of how liquid CO2 might have behaved on Mars. We can test different scenarios and see how well they match what we see on the planet.
So we can basically create a virtual Mars in our computers and run all sorts of experiments.
Exactly. It's like having a time machine that lets us go back and see how CO2 might have shaped Mars over billions of years.
This is what makes science so cool. It's this constant back and forth between observation, experimentation, and modeling. It's like we're weaving together all these different pieces of evidence to create a better picture of what's really going on.
And the more pieces we have, the more complete and detailed that picture becomes.
Now, I want to talk about the future for a bit.
Hmm.
What does this CO2 discovery mean for actually sending humans to Mars? We mentioned this earlier, but I want to dive in a bit more.
Okay, well, if we can actually find those underground reservoirs of liquid CO2, it could be a huge benefit for future Martian colonists.
So we're not just talking about something that's scientifically interesting. This is something that could actually be useful for humans living on Mars.
Absolutely. CO2 is a pretty versatile molecule. We could use it to produce fuel, building materials, breathable air, maybe even terraform the planet.
Terraforming Mars using CO2, that sounds crazy.
I know, it seems far-fetched, but it's something that some scientists are actually exploring. CO2 is a greenhouse gas, so if we could release enough of it into the Martian atmosphere, it could potentially warm up the planet and make the environment more livable for humans.
I can almost picture it now, Martian colonists using that underground CO2 to build their homes, grow their food, and eventually transform the whole planet.
It's a really inspiring vision.
Yeah.
And it all comes back to this one discovery. We started out thinking about CO2 as a simple gas, and now we're realizing that it could be the key to the future of Mars.
It's a reminder that even the smallest discoveries in science can open up all sorts of new possibilities.
That's absolutely right. And that's what keeps science so interesting. It's a journey of discovery, and you never know where it might lead you.
Well, this deep dive into liquid CO2 on Mars has certainly been an incredible journey. We've questioned our assumptions, imagined all sorts of possibilities, and even glimpsed a future where humans could use CO2 to make a new home on another planet.
It's been a really fun exploration, and it shows why we do what we do. We dig into these mysteries of the universe, not just to find answers, but to keep that curiosity alive, to dream big, and to remember that there's always more to learn.
And so we're going to leave you with this thought. If liquid CO2 can shape a planet, what else might be possible out there in the vastness of space? Never stop exploring, never stop asking questions, and never lose your sense of wonder.
And until next time, keep looking up.